Good afternoon. I'm Jason Gilmore, Senior Associate Director of Development at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business. And on behalf of the University of Michigan, welcome to the latest installment of Victor's Heroes Wolverines, a series of Zoom webinars with content delivered by University of Michigan leaders, faculty, and students. This series was created as a way for us to continue to connect virtually with our alumni, parents, friends, and students during the pandemic. The main focus of these sessions has been on the safe reactivation of campus, supporting our students through this unprecedented time, COVID research, and the long-term impacts on the pandemic on society. This is our 8th installment of the series, and today we'll focus on economic recovery after COVID-19. What do we learn in hindsight from the early days of the pandemic? What is the current state of the economy? And what are possible future insights and trends and long-term impacts? To help us kick off our discussion, joining us, we have Bob Patterson. Bob is Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Avient Corporation. I'm proud to say Bob is also a 2-time Michigan Ross alumnus, earning a Bachelor of Business Administration and Master of Accounting degrees. He is a long-standing supporter of the school and has generously given his time, talent, and treasure, including serving on the Ross Alumni Board of Governors and currently as a member of the advisory board for our Payton Center for Research in Accounting. I've gotten to know Bob over the years and can attest he's a sound understanding of this topic. And because of that, I'm very excited to welcome here today's session. Bob?
Well, thanks, Jason. I really appreciate being invited today. It's an honor to be an alumni, but also to continue to engage with this school in so many ways. A few years ago, I had the entire board of directors for Avient, as well as my leadership team at the Ross School for a couple of days with Dean DeRue and other professors. We collaborated on a number of strategic topics, and the board still remembers it as one of our best experiences together. Not surprisingly, COVID-19 wasn't mentioned or discussed. To me, one of the greatest learnings of the pandemic has been the surprise of it all and the speed with which it changed almost every facet of the world professionally and personally. I am grateful for everyone involved in the response and recovery efforts and pleased to say that we are seeing signs of increased demand in a number of end markets. And in this regard, I look forward to the discussion today. And to get things started, I'd like to introduce Scott DeRue. Scott is the Edward J. Fry Dean of the School of Business. He is among the 50 most influential business professors in the world, a sought-after researcher and speaker in the field of leadership and organizational transformation. What you may not know about Scott is that he is an accomplished mountaineer, and he recently led a team of students and alumni to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest point in Africa. It's a pretty impressive accomplishment. I wish I had been a participant in that adventure. Maybe I'll catch the next one. For now, I'll hand the call over to you, Scott.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. And thank you for that kind and warm introduction. As Jason said, Bob has been a wonderful supporter of Michigan, the Ross School, and I'm deeply grateful for your support, your continued engagement. And I too remember that board meeting and your leadership team meeting very fondly and was privileged to have the opportunity. Today we have 2 of the world's leading economists with us to share their insights on the economic impact of COVID and our shared path forward for economic recovery. But before we jump in, I do want to say on behalf of everyone at the University of Michigan, our students, our faculty, our staff, I hope all of you and your loved ones and your families are healthy and safe during what has been a really challenging and trying time for our community and our families around the globe. So our thoughts are with all of you. I'll begin today's conversation with just a few initial observations about the impact of COVID on our economy and some of the rhetoric that we hear in the news and media and the like. And then we'll bring our guest on for what will most certainly be a very insightful and thought-provoking conversation. First, if we look back, it's relatively easy to understand the impact of COVID in hindsight. But anyone, as we look forward, anyone who tells you that they know with certainty what will happen in the future is fooling you and possibly themselves. Since COVID began, experts have predicted recovery patterns ranging from U-shaped, V-shaped, W-shaped, K-shaped, pretty much every letter in the alphabet as a shape of recovery for the economy and with regards to the pandemic. None of us know with certainty what's going to happen, but there are some trends that shine a light on what is happening and what we might expect in the future. And it is those trends that will really ground our conversation today. Second, if we look at the data and those trends, there are some things that we know in terms of the impact of COVID on our economy. We know, for example, that the health of our economy is directly tied to the health of our communities, meaning that the economic recovery will at least partially be a function of how well we manage the pandemic. For example, when cases rise, consumer sentiment often declines, and vice versa. And so the two are interrelated, how well we manage the pandemic and what actually happens in our economy. We know that the initial government stimulus helped keep some people, some businesses afloat. Of course, we don't know what the future holds in terms of additional stimulus support here in the United States or other parts around the world, or what the impact would be, and that'll be something we talk about today. We know unemployment here in the US, for example, has doubled to over 8% from its low of around 4% or so. But in the last month, we also know that new job postings have increased. So there is some hope emerging and some trends that give us some indication of what might be on the horizon. We also know that global trade volume and production have declined sharply. And if we look at history over decades, we know that when that happens, we generally see a steep recovery in the year or two that follows. But of course, we don't know right now how deep the downturn will fall. We're in the middle of it, or when it does begin to turn, how quickly that recovery would come. And we know that the economic impact and the early recovery patterns that we're seeing are very, very different depending on where you live, what socioeconomic status you fall into, what your job level or job type is, or what industry or sector you're in. And these disparities, this unevenness across our economy will certainly be a big part of our conversation today as well. These are the types of issues that are on the minds of every business owner, every business leader, every economist, and I imagine many of you as well. And hopefully that's what has inspired or motivated you to join our conversation today. And it is today that we are so very fortunate to have two of the world's leading economists with us to discuss these issues and more. So let me introduce them. My dear friend, colleague, Francine Lafontaine is the William Davidson Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy. She's also a professor of economics. She is one of the leading authorities in the world on small businesses. She has served as the Senior Associate Dean for the Ross School and continues serving on our leadership team today, where she leads a lot of our impact-related initiatives and centers and institutes. She formerly served as the Director of Economics for the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and has been a visiting scholar at universities such as MIT and Stanford. Francine, welcome to the conversation today.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's great to be here, so I look forward to it.
Excellent, thank you. And second and up is Matthew Shapiro. Matthew is the Lawrence R. Klein Collegiate Professor of Economics, where he is widely regarded as one of the leading authorities on fiscal and monetary policy, as well as the economics of aging and retirement. He currently serves as the director of the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, which this center conducts some of the world's most important national level survey and data collection efforts about how our country is functioning, including one that you would be really familiar with, the Survey of Consumer Attitudes, which you frequently see reported on the news. Matthew, welcome to today's conversation.
Thanks, great to be here.
Excellent. Francine, Matthew, I'm honored to share the virtual stage, if you will, with you today. I admire both of you and your long history and track record of just doing amazing work in understanding how our economy functions, and as educators and as scholars, you are both remarkable. For today's conversation, I'm going to start us off with a few questions. But to everyone who's joining us, we really want this to be a conversation where you have an opportunity to ask us questions as well. So if you do have questions about COVID, about its impact on the economy, about our recovery, please submit those questions via the Q&A function. And our team will share with me some of the most common questions. We may not get to all of them, I'm sure, but we'll do our very best. But we do want this to be as much of a two-way dialogue as possible, given the format that we're in. It's meant to really be a casual conversation among friends, and there's several hundred of us here that all have one thing in common, which is a love for the University of Michigan. So Matthew, let's start with you and start with a look back on the impact of the global pandemic. Since the pandemic began in early 2020, what do you see as the most significant impact the pandemic has had on our economy to date?
Well, the most obvious one, which you did a great job of summarizing, is just the very sharp, unprecedented decline in activity and employment that we saw in March and April. And now there's been a gradual return back over the summer, but we stabilized to essentially recession level and bad recession levels of unemployment. Unemployment rate's about 8.4%. You also see that in the attitude of the consumer. As you pointed out, we collect the consumer sentiment survey. That fell from about 100 to 78. That's sort of we're at recession, almost depression levels in the consumer outlook, and it's basically been flat since the middle of the summer. The other thing I'd emphasize is how much this is driven not by economic policy or the stock market, but it's really the public health situation and the response to it. That's what drove the decline, and that's also what's going to mediate the recovery. The final thing to stress is just how disparate the impacts have been. And again, you alluded to this. So big firms have been affected differently. There have been firms that are doing quite well, particularly in the tech area. On the other hand, some sectors are doing just terribly. Service sectors where they're essentially person-facing service interactions. And those have suffered very serious decline. They're coming back slowly. And looking ahead to our discussion, they'll face long run adjustments. They'll be probably, we'll go to restaurants and hotels and travel differently for the foreseeable future. There's also been tremendous disparate impacts across income and other demographic groups. Jay Powell of the Federal Reserve Board has a very interesting statistic that 40% of those earning at the 40th percentile or lower. So essentially the bottom half lost their jobs in this crisis. So it's very concentrated job losses among low income. You also see racial disparities. Blacks suffered disproportionately because they disproportionately live in cities. Hispanics suffer disproportionately because they are engaged in this kind of service occupations that were affected. So we have very disparate impacts, and many of the social and economic divides that we have been long aware of and long studied at the University of Michigan have been brought into sharp relief by this crisis.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. It's very insightful, and the just diversity of disparities, if you will, whether it's sector or socioeconomic or otherwise, is really remarkable, and I think it's going to create some challenges as we think about policies that we'll get into later in the conversation about how we develop policies that address those matters. Francine, let me come to you, and same question. When you look at the impact of the pandemic on our economy, what do you see as the most significant impact, building on what Matthew offered?
Well, as you mentioned, I spend quite some time thinking about small businesses and what affects them, and looking at small businesses during this crisis. It's pretty clear that they are very highly affected, on average, more so than larger firms that have better mechanisms to deal with various issues. On top of that, they are in the kind of sectors, predominantly in the kind of sectors that are very people-facing and therefore affected quite a bit during this crisis. So it's kind of a confluence of they're small, so they don't have certain ways of being able to adjust, and they are also in the industries that among others, are hurt a lot. So if you look at something like the hospitality industry, the unemployment rate, hospitality defined as restaurants as well as hotels and stuff, the unemployment rate went all the way to almost 40% in April. It's now down. So the unemployment rate in that industry has gone down and is around 20% at this point, but that's still a very high level. And again, it's a lot of jobs that are towards the service oriented and therefore not necessarily highly paid that are affected there too. So we see a bit of recovery, but a very long-term potential effect. We see it also in a few different ways. So Yelp data tells us that about 75,000 businesses with employees have closed, the kind of businesses that they keep track of, have closed permanently at this point. And 16,000 or so of them would be restaurants. So they're thinking about, you know, what will cities look like? We need to think about what kind of amenities will be available in cities, because we do see restaurants, bars, places to gather as being a big part of what we enjoy out there. And without the numbers of them that we have been accustomed to, it'll be a different kind of world that we get back to. At the same time, there's a big uptick right now in business formation statistics, interestingly. So people are starting new businesses at a rate that's not been seen since more than a decade. So we see both of these types of things, in part because there's activities now. People are doing things online. They're developing, you know, businesses that they can sell things, but send them online. So they're thinking about alternative ways to make the businesses work. And small business owners are involved in thinking about how to keep their businesses alive, of course, as well. So we see both sides going on again.
Yeah, the business creation statistics, very fascinating. And is that, is the growth in business formation that we're seeing now, is it at a greater rate than what we've seen in prior downturns?
Yes, quite a bit. So basically there's both opportunity potentially that is leading people to do this. There's also necessity. People don't have jobs, they're at home. They're looking for things that they can create and sell out there.
Yeah.
And the growth in online activity is something that people are forecasting will remain, and therefore they're trying to catch some aspects of that growth as well.
Yeah, so where there's challenge, there's also opportunity here. Yeah, and it's good. And so let me ask, so one of the things we've talked about unemployment going up. We've talked about the tens of thousands of businesses that have closed. Matthew, I know one of the things that you look at really closely is the distinction between what's happening in the markets with what's happening in reality on the ground with businesses and our communities. And I'm sure that a number of people joining us today have questions about how we reconcile these two things. The stock market has, you know, after its initial steep decline in the spring, has had a tremendous summer in terms of growth. How do we reconcile that with what we're seeing in terms of business closure and unemployment going up and the like? How do you reconcile these two different dynamics?
Well, let me first start by saying it's very hard to explain the stock market, even in normal times. Well, with that caveat, I will give it a try. So the first thing to note is that the stock market is not the economy. The stock market is mainly represented by large, high capitalization firms. So none of the small businesses that Francine was talking about who are suffering so directly are listed on the stock market. On the other hand, there's some very big tech companies who are doing well because they're able to provide important services and maybe not thrive in this environment, but do much better. So that's part of what's pushing the stock market up, that it's concentrated on big tech firms which are doing relatively well. And some of our industrial firms that aren't doing as well are actually a fairly small fraction of the stock market. The second thing is monetary policy. Interest rates are very low. that's an appropriate monetary policy in response to the weak economy, but that tends to push up the market because it makes stocks more attractive relative to bonds. So I would point to the concentration of tech firms and to monetary policy as determinants of the high stock market.
And what, Matthew, a follow-up question. And this is in some of the questions that are coming in. What's your take on the Fed keeping interest rates essentially near zero? What are the pros and cons of that, short-term and long-term, from your perspective?
Well, the Fed is following its mandate, which is for stable prices and full employment. And there's not an inflation problem and not one for the foreseeable future. Both measured current inflation are low, and financial market indicators, particularly the bond market, suggest inflation is expected to be low for the foreseeable future. So given that, the Fed is pursuing its mandate by trying to stimulate the economy by pushing interest rates down. It can only do so much of that. Interest rates, as you say, are close to zero. So I believe the policy is appropriate, but it's going to have relatively limited effect because companies such as that aren't able to sell their products because of the pandemic aren't going to want to borrow money. So even if money is fairly cheap, the stimulus effect will be fairly limited. So the Fed is moving policy in the right direction. It's having effects on financial markets, but it's not a panacea.
Yeah. And there's a number of questions coming in that are policy related, and we'll get to a number of those. Francine, one question that came in that speaks to what's happening in small businesses that connects to some of the consumer sentiment, consumer attitude data that Matthew was talking about earlier, is the Small Business Optimism Index out of the NFIB has shown an uptick in the last 2 to 3 months where optimism is increasing. Do you see that continuing? What do you think is underlying that? And how do we reconcile that with the closures that we're seeing among a lot of businesses, say in the service sectors and the like?
So I think in part this optimism reflects the fact that some businesses in various areas in the country have been able to reopen, in some cases with constraints, but in some, so there's a variety of types of businesses, but I'll focus on the ones that are more retail and service and small service and restaurant type businesses. And they've been able to reopen at least partially in a number of places, and they've been thinking about how else to generate business, and they've been going online and doing different things. So they're seeing, a certain set of them are seeing ways that they could potentially, make it through this crisis. And that's the reason unemployment has decreased in these sectors, right? They've rehired a number of their people. So, but at the same time, there's been months where some of these businesses were unable to make any money. And so they've ended up closing, and they don't see a future where they could reopen. So I think it makes sense that the optimism is back a little, but not to the point where people are very comfortable, because these types of businesses, again, how well they will do depends on how we control the pandemic and how comfortable people ultimately are at going out and getting their nails done, or going to the restaurant, or doing the various things that going to the gym. These things that we've been accustomed to doing up to now, and that we've stopped a lot doing as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, and it's I mean, one of the big open questions is how quickly we will change our behavior, either back to what it was or some modified version that's in between, and what that's going to look like medium and long term. I'm not sure anybody really knows at this point. One question that came in that connects to this sense of optimism with connecting it, Matthew, to the question that was asked of you of markets. And if either of you can answer this, the three of us are going to go start a consulting business or an investment business later this afternoon. Are we truly seeing the bottom of the recession with the media reporting layoffs? We've got airlines that are possibly tomorrow laying off tens of thousands of people as one example. And so where are we in terms of recession, macroeconomy? Are we, where on the arc are we? And again, if you can answer that with certainty, we have a bright future.
I can't answer it with certainty, but I do have some thoughts. As you point out, the economy, there's certain parts of the economy that look like they're doing better, but there are also certain parts that look like they will face added distress and subsequent problems. And a lot of that depends on the public health situation, how that evolves. That will drive not just current demand, but willingness of firms to invest and hire workers, and frankly, willingness of workers to go to work. So addressing the public health concern is really the major challenge, and I think that will drive the economy. There was a lot of economic stimulus quite early. There was a $3 trillion stimulus package. That's largely worked its way through. That was really important in making what was a really terrible first half of the year not be a complete disaster. But that has largely been spent by the government, and if anything, the government looks like it's moving towards fiscal contraction, and that would be a big mistake. It was a mistake that was made after the 2008-2009 financial crisis of reducing fiscal stimulus too quickly. I had actually, frankly, thought we'd learned from that mistake, and weren't going to make that mistake again. But now, with lack of action on economic policies to address the crisis, it looks like we might be doing that again. So with the withdrawal of the stimulus we saw in the first half of the year, we might see either not necessarily a slowing down, but a tapering off of the more rapid bounce back than we saw earlier in the summer.
There's a number of questions coming in. One of them is, I guess, Pelosi and Mnuchin met again today. I haven't been following the news this afternoon as closely. So the question is really around what's the next stimulus need to look like in order to sustain and continue to advance the recovery. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. And we've all stressed on this panel how it was really the health situation driving the economy. So thinking about economic stimulus that would both stimulate the economy, but I think that's secondary. The primary consideration should be addressing the harms done by the pandemic to the economy and to public health. And that would have the virtuous effect of both stimulating the economy, but actually directly addressing harms. Let me point to three things that I think should be considered. The first is doing something about state and local budgets. They've been hurt by the spending and drop in tax revenue. And if there's not some federal aid to state and local governments, we're going to see big cutbacks, and they'll be directly affect the public, say, by cutting back education exactly when it's needed and exactly when costs of education are high. And there's excellent evidence from 2008, 2009, when some of the stimulus was directed to state and local, that it's very effective at stimulating employment, both in those sectors, but more generally. The second thing I would point to is sort of targeted relief. There's still a lot of people unemployed, and the expanded benefits for unemployment insurance have expired, and targeting extra benefits to those who've lost a job. First, it helps people who are genuinely hurting from the pandemic, and two, it will stimulate the economy. The third thing I'd point to is direct spending on public health. Spending money on tests would stimulate the economy, but it would also help people get back to shopping, back to work. So I think looking at what's been harmed by the pandemic, focusing spending there will both address the direct harms of the pandemic and will lead to a quicker recovery.
Francine, any additional thoughts on the stimulus and where we're at?
I think there is a need for more stimulus money. I totally agree with the areas that Matthew has emphasized. I also think we need to think seriously about the kind of rent that people are going to owe at the end of December, given the current policy, the current moratorium, the need to really think seriously about how we can help people stay in their homes. So I guess, I mean, fundamentally, the unemployment help should achieve that. And that's a really important thing to do during a pandemic. Again, kind of not circulating the issues with the transmission of COVID. And also think about, you know, healthcare reform longer term, because this connection of healthcare for individual healthcare insurance with their job in a pandemic is really a pretty complex issue to deal with. And so that should be something that people put on the list of things, not direct stimulus, but really list of things to revisit in a serious way in the coming years.
Yeah, and one of the things with regards to the stimulus packages that lines up with some of the conversation that we've had thus far is support for small business relative to, say, large business. And we've seen everything from the airlines get stimulus support down to the Main Street Lending Program, for example, and some of the smaller businesses, if you will. When you think about those disparities, and I want to shift the conversation to also talking about some of the large businesses and institutions, because there's a few questions coming in there. How do you think about the government support and stimulus with respect to the large institutions and large businesses that employ tens of thousands and thousands of people? But we also have 30 million small businesses in the country that employ 60 million people. How do you think about these policies and the stimulus packages, making sure that we're serving both of those segments effectively?
So I would answer first and foremost that we need to think about which industries are most affected by this. And so which industries are almost unable to continue to function. The airline industry is one of them, and it is important that we maintain some infrastructure that will allow travel. So that is an industry that needs attention. We can think about maybe the hotel sector, hospitality, all of these types of things we can target more specifically the sectors that are most affected. But even within that, we do know that, so I'll give an example that Dominos has been doing really well. It's made the news, and Walmart has been doing really well. There's a number of large companies in some of these sectors also that have been doing perfectly fine. So they don't need the kind of support that we're talking about. So it does need to be targeted industry-wise, but even within industries, we need to be careful to really target the entities that need it the most.
Do you all have any hypotheses around some of the questions that have come in, or around some of the hypotheses we may have about how large businesses, and possibly small businesses as well, act in terms of automation, outsourcing jobs or offshoring, using technology to really rethink, restructure their business so they come back, but they come back in a different way. Either those jobs leave, or maybe those jobs no longer exist because organizations have had to pivot in ways that maybe pre-pandemic they didn't expect. Do you have a sense of the trends we might see in terms of whether it's globalization or technology as a result of the last 6, 7, 8 months with the pandemic?
I'll just say one short thing on technology. That it's undeniable that there's been big changes in the way that people work in lots of sectors, and in the way that they consume goods in lots of types of goods. And so that's going to have a long-term effect. It's going to speed up a number of changes in the way that we produce things and in the way that we interact with products as consumers. I'll leave it there and let Matthew answer, because I cut him off a little bit.
No, I agree, Francine. some changes will be different. For example, the car wash on South Industrial has replaced the person who collects the money with a automatic machine in response to the minimizing face-to-face interactions. That presumably is going to stay there post-pandemic. So some jobs will be lost, but others will be gained. So the way the hospitality industry delivers goods and services will be changed. So there'll be more delivery in the food business and more takeout and probably less dining in. It's not clear which way employment will go. Sort of thinking more globally, I think there's going to be a lot of reconsideration of supply chains and shortening supply chains, adding redundancy to supply chains, and some of that might be quite good for employment and create new opportunities. And businesses are responding to these challenges. Also, the way work is organized is going to change. Businesses have learned that some activities can take place away from the office, but they're also facing genuine losses in productivity from the loss of interaction and the loss of teamwork. So I think things will change, and we'll learn some lessons that will actually improve productivity and create new opportunities and new jobs.
Yeah, you mentioned, Francine, you mentioned Domino's. Matthew, you mentioned food delivery and how that might create jobs and the like. Just a brief story to bring those 2 points together. Not too long ago, I had Domino's. We live in Ann Arbor, the home of Domino's and headquarters. And they were running a pilot, and I used my phone and ordered a pizza. And not too long after that, an autonomous vehicle pulled up and with a keypad on the window where I punch in the last 4 digits of my number, the window rolls down, my pizza pops out, and the car drives off. So even for things like food delivery, what that looks like 10 years from now, I mean, that's an experiment, and it's not widespread, but 10 years from now it could be. And so what that looks like in terms of employment and opportunities, I think is going to be really interesting to see how it plays out over time. It was the first time I've ever had any delivery with an autonomous vehicle with no person. So that was pretty interesting. I want to turn back to policy matters. And we talked a little bit about some of the policies that have been put in place, the stimulus payments to households, unemployment benefits. We talked about the Fed and its take on interest rates. And we talked about the need for further stimulus. One question that has come up in the chat is, should we be caring about deficits?
Yes, but tomorrow, to quote a famous saint, I'm an economist who worries a lot about the deficit, and I wonder how we're going to pay this back. On the other hand, I'm also an economist who pays attention to markets, and interest rates are at a historical low. So the public is willing to lend to the US government at extremely low rates. This is the time to run a deficit when the economy is in shambles, when there's a need for extra spending, and when taxes are low. That's what deficits are for. So in the short run, and the short run is going to be years, not months, running this deficit is not a problem, and that's what financial markets are telling us. We do have to figure out in the longer run how to pay this off and how to face sort of structural problems that were there beforehand related to the aging of the population and increased burden of Medicare in particular. So eventually we're going to have more growth or figure out how to reduce spending or raise taxes, probably a combination of all of them. But right now, the deficit is not a concern.
I think there's a lot of consensus among economists on that particular point, that there really needs to be further investments in the economy at this point in time, given all the disruptions and the continued issues with the pandemic. We just need to really pay attention to what's going on out there and target relief where it's needed.
If I put my devil's advocate hat on just for a moment, with regards to the deficit, I can certainly see how essentially spending money to get growth, sort of reactivated, employment and so forth through the challenges of the pandemic. But it seems to me that at least in modern day, even when times are good, we've been unable to sort of change structurally our sort of behavior and outlook on spending relative to what the budget looks like, and we just continue to escalate the deficit even in good times. How do you all reconcile the need to spend through this period, in part like we've spent through other challenges in our history, but we haven't really shown an ability to bring the deficit down systematically and change how our budgets are structured? How do you reconcile that?
I think you need the political scientists on the panel. I mean, there's gridlock in Washington. I think most economists would have wanted to see the deficit falling, not early in the recovery from the financial crisis, but late in the recovery. You precisely want deficits falling most of the time, or the debt falling most of the time, precisely so you can afford to not worry about it in times like this or times like the Great Recession. And you're quite right. Instead of having a sawtooth where the deficit rises sharply in crisis and then falls, it's been rising sharply in crisis and then falling either slowly or in the case of the last decade, not at all. And that's, again, layered on top of our longer run structural problems of paying for the benefits we've promised older Americans in Social Security and Medicare. So we do have to face that long run, but this is not the time to be worrying about that this year, and I would say next and maybe the year beyond. But I do hope there's a consensus to do something in the long run. If there's not, eventually interest rates will tick up and the markets will tell us that we have to do it.
So one question that just came in that's a follow-up to this is, how concerned are we that the investments that are being made are really to boost consumption rather than investment?
Are you referring to the short-run response to the crisis?
I think so. I mean, I'm just looking at the question.
Then,
I think that's the case.
That maintaining consumption, making sure people don't get evicted, can pay their food bills and so on. That makes a lot of sense in a crisis, and that's what we would want to do. Longer run, I think there's broad consensus that we should be doing more spending. Clearly, we haven't spent enough on public health infrastructure. We're seeing that partially as a legacy of cutbacks in state and local governments post Great Recession. So having both public and private infrastructure is important. But again, that's not going to be the focus of the immediate recovery program, but that should be a longer run aim when we think about what's the right mix of spending and taxes.
And in fact, a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about an infrastructure program that was never put in the end on the table. There is a need for infrastructure investment, but again, that's not what the stimulus money would be focused on. Although in some cases, in dealing with the pandemic, in dealing with testing and other things like that, those are investments in the capacity of people to participate in the economy and therefore in our growth ultimately, right? There is no way, again, the pandemic and the current economic crisis are intertwined. And without investing to deal with the pandemic, there is no way to really see a nice way to get out of the current situation. It would be a pretty disastrous one if we don't invest in that.
Yeah, and in some basic sense, that consumption is what allows us to also fuel investment, all right? And so those two are interrelated as well. I want to get back to policy, and we've talked about the disparities across industry sectors, the disparities across different geographies. I saw a map the other day, I believe it was on Bloomberg or somewhere, where they showed almost county by county sort of the geographic disparities, the socioeconomic levels and the disparities there. If Mnuchin and Pelosi and others sort of gave you the keys to the car and carte blanche, you designed the policy, how would you approach policy development in ways that would meet the needs of those who need it the most going forward? What if we look out, whether it's the next stimulus package or even longer term than that? How do you think about policy development? What's most needed to address those disparities that you identified earlier?
I'll just say something that Matthew said earlier, which is first and foremost, helping with unemployment support. That is, that is the set of people that are suffering the most through this crisis right now. The people who've lost their job, and the vast majority of whom were in jobs that are not, that don't pay that high to begin with. So I think dealing with the unemployment aspect is a really crucial part of stimulus at this point.
So I agree with that, and then so let me add, focusing on spending that benefits our children is really important, because if you think about the disparities, what we can do about disparities in the long run, focusing on children is essential. And there's a lot of evidence going back to these studies which looked at the effect of the flu pandemic in 1918, that those who were young during the flu pandemic suffered losses of income and losses of health and even lower marriage rates 50, 60 years later. So focusing on spending that would benefit the kids, and the fact that we haven't figured out how to get schools opened, and that we've been focusing on, say, getting bars open at the expense of not having schools open, I think is going to cost us for decades to come. And then there's the knock-on effect that the state and local governments are under tremendous pressure because of loss of tax revenues. So we'll see echoes effects through their budgets if state and local governments aren't assisted. I would think about spending that would relieve pressure on our educational institutions, particularly the K through 12 educational institutions, would be both benefit for stimulating the economy and also be quite important for addressing both short run and long run disparities that have been brought to bear or have been revealed through this crisis.
Yeah. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention something else, which is that this difficulty we've had at reopening schools for reasons I agree of, not controlling the pandemic, for, not always putting all the energy in the right place in order to open back schools. That also has had consequences on gender disparities, for that matter, right? When children cannot go to school, it typically falls on the woman in the household, typically, to have more of a series of activities that she has to engage in, and that has made differences in gender also starker than they used to be in lots of different places, including for those kinds of jobs where people are able to continue to do their job through online, these kinds of tools that we're using right now, Zoom and things like that. Even if they can, if the children are around and they are young enough, it's quite difficult to keep up everything all at once. So.
Yeah, so in some sense, investing in K through 12 education would also help the moms and dads be able to contribute to wherever their place of employment is in ways that right now may be even more constrained. So from a productivity perspective, you could actually get a bump in productivity indirectly by investing in education if the investments were made in the right way. One of the things I would be remiss if we had a television spectacle last night with our presidential debate. And certainly the pandemic was part of that. The economy was part of that. Any sort of postmortem reflections, if you will, on the debate last night and where you see the impact in terms of policy development and forward-looking what we might expect, whether it's in the healthcare space with regards to the pandemic, whether it's stimulus in terms of business and the economy. Any reflections after last night's, I'll call it a conversation?
Francine, why don't you take that one?
Let's just say we saw a contrast yesterday in terms of not just personalities, but leadership capabilities. I'll just put it this way. And I think that it highlighted the fact that it really is important to have a consistent message, to have somebody that, to have a whole system that is working together to try and get through a crisis. And we have not had that, I will say. And the conversation yesterday just was consistent with that continuation of the lack of consistency in addressing this on one side, and the hope for potentially fixing that if we had a different government in place. So I just had to say that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, and one thing that I think comes out of last night is, you know, we need a plan where all the pieces that we've talked about, whether from healthcare to education to the business support, we need all of those pieces to work together, and we actually need our political groups to actually come together and work together there as well. We absolutely need more dialogue in this regard, because it's not clear that either side has a good plan for how those pieces are going to work together at this point.
I mean, the pandemic has illustrated the importance of having coordinated government action, and the states have done great. We've had great leadership in the state of Michigan and many states, state of Ohio also. Federalism has in some sense bailed us out with a dysfunctional national government, but some things like having coordinated policy, given how interconnected we are, is just essential. And there needs to be policies that will really drive down the virus to manageable levels so the kids can get back to school, people can get back to business and get back to normal activity. That's going to take consensus towards collective action that has been remarkably absent in our politics for some time now. And last night was
likewise. That was my biggest takeaway, is the need for coordinated action. So Francine, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us for the conversation. To everyone who joined us, we're extremely grateful. Hopefully you found the conversation thoughtful, insightful, engaging. Jason, I welcome you back to the virtual stage for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. That was very interesting, and to say the least, one of the best events that I've seen out of the entire series. I'd like to thank Professor LaFontaine and Professor Shapiro, and to you, Scott, and to Bob Patterson, and most importantly, to all our guests for joining us. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and go Blue. Have a great rest of your week.